Okay guys, I'm going to do my best. I won't say Jaguar the way I and everyone I know where I'm from in the Midwest have always said it, similar to how most people in the States here say Porsche instead of
Porsche.
But I can't at this point go full on and say Jaguar. So I'm sticking to Jaguar. Jaguar? Because that's how Jay Leno says it, so it must be correct. Of all the great sports cars that came out of post-war Great Britain, it's pretty hard to argue against the Jaguar E-Type as being the most significant. Prior to its release, Jaguar was known for making cars that coupled technical sophistication and performance with a sense of style and class. Hence the name Jaguar. Perhaps no other animal on the planet fits the company's identity from 1935 on, though they didn't pick up that name till quite a bit later. I should mention the main source for this video is Jonathan Wood's awesome book called Jaguar E-Type: The Complete Story. If you guys want to dig deeper and learn more about this iconic car, I've linked the book in the description below. Though the E-Type's roots go back to the very beginning of the company really, before Jaguar was even Jaguar, in many ways, it all starts with an idea from the company coming out of World War II, an initiative really to build the best, fastest sports car in the world, made not solely for British or European customers, but rather sports car enthusiasts all over the world. Achieving this would mean massive changes for the company in terms of engine development. They would have to create an engine that is capable of 160 horsepower to reach the goal of 120 miles per hour. And ultimately, they decided to utilize a design that had previously been limited primarily to race machines and some Italian touring cars, a double overhead cam, inline 4 or really inline 6 as it ended up being. And this was first unveiled at the 1948 London Motor Show, the Jaguar XKE 120, and it really stole the show. It was a beautifully designed, unique, top-down two-seater. It was a roadster and it was powered by a massive 3.4-liter twin overhead cam 6-cylinder engine. The XKE 120 could easily surpass that 120 mile per hour target. At one point during this time, it was once clocked at 136 miles per hour in Belgium for the flying mile. Now this car is worthy of an entire video in and of itself, but in understanding the later E-Type, we must look to Le Mans and a specific race version of the XKE 120 known as the C-Type. The year was 1951, and Jaguar was determined to prove their racing prowess. The car they used was essentially an aerodynamic, lighter, and more powerful version of the XKE 120. The result would propel Jaguar even further onto the world stage, despite two of the C-Type cars dropping out. One raced by Peter Walker and Whitehead would take the win at a record speed of 93.49 miles per hour.
Seems that nothing can stop the flying Jaguar gaining a clear-cut victory. To be worth entering at Le Mans, a car must be good. To win, it must be a world beater. And here comes that world beater now, the Type C XKE 120 Jaguar, a great car, finely driven.
This was the first time a British car took the checkered flag since 1935, and in '53 the C-Type would take first, second, and fourth. We'll talk more about this car later on. In terms of structure, the later D-Type race car from Jaguar would further this experiment in weight savings and better aerodynamics. Along with loads of advanced tech for this time, through the 50s, the road-going XK was also evolving. It would become the XK 140 and then also the XK 150, no longer designated because of top speed. Really, the XK 140, for example, was only slightly faster than the 120. So in 1956, they began working on an entirely new flagship sports car with a radical new design that would capture the motoring world and in many regards help build Jaguar's reputation going forward. One of the craziest but perhaps most important aspects of the E-Type's development is, well, how long it took. As 1956 came to a close, work on the overall body line started, but the car wouldn't come to production until 1961, over 4 years later. By the end of the 50s, 3 prototypes of the later E-Type existed. The first one was called the E1A, and then this one the E2A. And all of the work on this model over those 4 years resulted in a truly radical looking sports car. And the overwhelmingly positive response upon its debut at the 1961 Geneva Auto Show really was the result of all of this work over those 4 years. This was a car that not only looked unique, it was truly beautiful. One of the curviest production cars ever produced and boasting a ridiculous 150 mile per hour top speed from the updated 3.8-liter version of the XK 120 inline 6, now producing some 265 horsepower. Well, that is according to Jaguar. It probably didn't make that much, but it could go 150. Now, the only thing more ridiculous than the car itself was the price. £2,000, and you could get your hands on one of these cars. The single fastest car made in Britain at the time, with the nearest rival being the Aston Martin DB4, priced at just under £4,000. The E-Type utilized a unique semi-monocoque frame, giving it incredible rigidity, such that very little changes were necessary when the open-top version was released. Rarely available on British cars at this time, it had self-contained independent rear suspension, an anti-roll bar, 11 and 10-inch disc brakes, which was really not common, and loads of other race features from the time were carried over from the earlier C and D-type race cars. The name XKE, as it was known here in America, perfectly summarizes what Jaguar was doing with this car. On the production side, they had their sporting XK line. Prior to this car, it had gotten all the way up to the XK 150 name, again no longer referring to the car's top speed. But for their racing program, the cars simply utilized a letter system. So the C-type, originally referring to competition, and then the D-type, because it was, just the next letter in the alphabet. So for them to call this car the E-type, as it was known in Europe, or even more significant, the XKE, was a way of saying that now Jaguar as a company was bringing their racing development to the production side of things in a way that they hadn't ever before. This car truly was a road-going version of the D-type race car, which was an evolution of the C-type. Like so much of the sports car segment through the 60s, the XKE would become more accommodating to those wanting more than just performance, but these early E-types were very much raw sports cars through and through in, only two-seater form early on. The 3.8-liter straight six produced incredible power for this time, in part thanks to the big triple SU carbs. Not only did this engine make amazing max power, it was also tuned to distribute power really evenly so that the car could be thoroughly usable everywhere. Jonathan Wood's amazing book that I mentioned before has a comparison between the E-Type and its contemporaries at its release in '61. For British sports cars, it beat out everything for top speed and was incredibly competitive in terms of price. On the worldwide stage, there was the Corvette, and it had a slightly lower top speed than the E-Type, and it was almost double the price. And then there was the Ferrari 250 GT Farina Coupe. That was over 3 times the price of the E-Type and had a 10 mile per hour less top speed. Only the Maserati 3500 GT beat it out with a 165 mile per hour top speed, and of course, that car was also approaching Ferrari prices. Though quite important at this time in terms of selling sports cars, for drivers, top speed isn't everything. At this time, when the speed limit was like 18 miles per hour, the ability to go 150 doesn't really do you much good. More than anything, this was Jaguar's way of saying that we have one of the fastest cars that you can get, and the biggest thing was that it was just so affordable compared to all those other high-end sort of hypercars of their day. Early testers of the new E-Type found that the performance was really outstanding. This was the fastest accelerating car that most of the testers had ever experienced, capable of 0 to 60 in under 7 seconds, which is pretty crazy for this time, and able to do 120 in 25.9 seconds. The car was smooth, it was unbelievably powerful and torquey, it handled really well thanks in part to the independent rear suspension, and the braking, of course, was amazing. The only real complaints had to do primarily with high oil consumption and really a weak gearbox, as well as some things like, bad and unadjustable seating. But these would all be fixed a few years later with the introduction of the 4.2-liter version. I think part of what made this engine so good is that it wasn't an all-new engine at this time. In this basic form, this double overhead cam inline 6 had existed for about 13 years, and this was sort of the peak evolution of the platform. It was a tried and tested performer, and over the course of the E-Type's life, it would continue to evolve and get faster and more powerful. In '64, the inline 6 would be bumped up to 4.2 liters, and then in its final iteration, due in part to emissions regulations, the E-Type would feature a massive V12 in 5.3 and later 6.0 liter displacement. And the car would change, quite a bit over this time. At the same time the car was launched over in Geneva, the XKE was unveiled on April 1st at the New York Motor Show. The American market had already proven to be essential to all British sports car companies during this time. Some 80% of E-types would cross the Atlantic. Testers in the US found that the interior and specifically seating was kind of problematic, as well as the dated, non-fully synchro gearbox. Car and Driver's test says this: "We feel the gearbox is definitely not on par with the performance of the car as a whole, and about the kindest thing we can say for it is that we didn't like it." This is a long-standing complaint that the E-Type inherits from the XK150, and it seems difficult to understand why the development of a new transmission with Porsche-type synchro mesh on all forward speeds, which reportedly has been going on for some time in Coventry, is not yielding results. It's even more difficult to see why the racing D-Type gearbox, which had synchro mesh even on first, could not be adapted to the new car as an interim solution until a really satisfactory transmission is available. Again, these are problems that would be fully rectified shortly for the production cars in '64, and all of this didn't stop Americans from going crazy for this car and saving all their pennies in hopes of getting their hands on this surprisingly affordable but incredibly high performance and, most importantly, beautiful sports car. In terms of the car's overall style, look no further than Enzo Ferrari's apparent statement about the car upon its release in 1961. According to many, he called it the most beautiful car ever made. Certainly, Ferrari can lay claim to many cars that could give the E-Type a run for its money in regards to beauty, but as much as this is a subjective thing, having the man himself look at this car, a car that cost a fraction of his machines, from Ferrari, where much of the price is due to that exotic, beautiful design, and to have him call this car the most beautiful car ever made, I feel like that really means something. If there was any car you would have expected to have been designed from wind tunnel testing, it's the Jaguar E-Type. And if you think that's the case, you'd actually be wrong. This car's overall lines are not the product of wind tunnel testing. Rather, it's about math. Now, we could go on for hours about this car, its evolution, its success in racing, and of course its legacy. Jonathan Wood's book even goes over how to go about picking a classic E-Type for yourself. And there's also a really awesome channel called Big Car. He has a video covering really the entire life of this car. But for me, I feel like what's most interesting is the overall look and style of the E-Type. How is it that Jaguar managed to design a car so beautiful that even Enzo Ferrari would admit its beauty to be superior to that of anything he made? Well, it starts with a young aerodynamicist from Bristol Aeroplane Company who joined Jaguar in 1950 and was commissioned to design an aerodynamic body for their C-Type race car. I feel that it's important to recognize these people when we talk about car designs from this time. This was before the time of superstar designers. Many of the great British cars that came out of this period were designed and styled by really brilliant people who in some ways never got recognized or paid well enough for the incredible work that they did. Those who worked with him, including Stirling Moss, have gone on record saying that Sayre should be considered among the greats in terms of automotive design. Malcolm Sayre's approach to this first race car, and then also the later D and eventually production E-Type, was quite different from that of his peers, and this is primarily due to the fact that he wasn't a car designer, and he didn't think of design the same way as most car designers at this time. He didn't view himself as a stylist. Rather, he approached the form of these cars that he made in a scientific manner. After the war, Sayre found himself teaching at the University of Baghdad, and there he met a German professor who, in the most German form, taught Sayre a system of designing shapes mathematically, something we would today call computer-aided design, or CAD. The late Norman Dewis, Jaguar's test driver at the time, recalls seeing Sayre at work designing a car. He says he would have a full-scape sheet. The full length of his wall, all across that sheet were colored curves and lines. Every 6 inches were vertical lines with figures. I used to say to him, I can't even see a car. Much of the result of this design, this curvaceousness that the E-Type has, was the result of testing. Sayre would tape pieces of wool all over the cars that he designed, and he would have testers drive around, constantly monitoring the wind as it was hitting the car. And the end result with the C, D, and E-Type was an incredibly aerodynamic car, not just from the way that the car curves and the lines, even down to the headlights. This car had amazingly low drag that you would have assumed was designed entirely in a wind tunnel. Sayer was a complete perfectionist. At one instance, someone experimented with putting the Jaguar badge on the hood and sort of pushing it down in so that it was nice and flush and smooth, and Sayer lost it, insisting it be taken off as it was taking away from the purity of this experiment in aerodynamics. Today, we might look at that badge and say that it's taking away from the purity of the style of the car, but for him, it was always about the science behind the design. And because of Sayer's overall approach, the design of the E-Type was the epitome of function leading to form. That streamlined look, the consistent curving lines, everything that makes the Jaguar E-Type distinct comes from that pure focus on aerodynamics. And I think this is really the reason why someone like Enzo Ferrari appreciated the car and apparently called it the most beautiful car ever made. Now, what do you guys think? Do you agree with old Enzo that the E-Type is the most beautiful car ever made? Have there been any cars that have topped it since the 1960s? Of course, beauty is subjective, but that's why we have a comment section here on YouTube, so let us know your thoughts down below. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one. Drive safe.